Hello friends, welcome back to my YouTube channel P Talk. And in this video, we will learn about some basic concepts of WebLogic server. So what is WebLogic server? So WebLogic server is an application server. I'm sure you heard about the application server and web server, and you might be confused between what is the exact difference between an application server and web server. So for that, I have also created another YouTube video. Okay, the link is there in the screen, and then it is there on the bottom of the video as well. Okay, so you can see that video if you wanted to understand the basic difference between an application server and a web server. Okay, but in a nutshell, we can say that because we are in an enterprise and digital world where uh, we have a multiple applications or multiple softwares running across our organization, and we have a multiple stakeholders, and then all the applications in the enterprise worlds are interacting with each other. Okay, and our business is getting growing day by day, and then number of users those are accessing our websites and applications, whether it is an internal users or external users, they are getting increased day by day. So for that, a web server is not sufficient. Okay, so to cater the demand of a dynamic environment, okay, dynamic applications where the application need to be interact with the multiple applications with the database in a high availability mode. So there you need an application server. So the web server, the specific purpose of web server initially was to serve some kind of a static and bit about dynamic pages as well. Okay, but now with the increasing growth of the technologies and the digital digitization, okay, across the world, the application server came in picture. Okay, so basically application server is where your business code is deployed and business logic is executed, and then uh, the result is shared back with the end users, or could be from the web servers or may not be from the web servers, because application server has the capabilities of a web server as well as the application server. So based on the architecture, your organization, department, the criticality of your application, the kind of a security you required, we prepare the architecture of an web server and application server. Okay, so what are the core component of WebLogic? Okay, the core component, or you can say the basic components of WebLogic. Okay, the first one is domain. Second is admin server, which you also say as an administrative server. Third is managed server, cluster, and data source. These are the basic core components of your WebLogic application server. Okay, so let us understand what is domain. So an Oracle WebLogic Server administration domain is a logical related group of Oracle WebLogic Server resources. So important term here is WebLogic server resources. So even you are new to Oracle WebLogic server, or maybe you are an expert. Okay, so whatever the component you know about the WebLogic server. Okay, when you install an WebLogic server, and then after that you start creating certain kind of resources like managed servers, clusters. Then you deploy the applications, node managers, right? JDBC connection pool, data sources. So whatever the terms that you know about the WebLogic server, okay, that is all called as a WebLogic resources, and all the resources included in a particular domain. So this is the very basic entity of WebLogic server. So when you install a WebLogic server, after installation of WebLogic server, first you have to create a domain, and then you have to create the different resources. Those will be inside your domain. Okay, so WebLogic server, it has the capability you can have a multiple domains from a single installation. Okay, but there are a lot of pros and cons of that one. So what does it mean when you install a WebLogic server and you create a domain, right? And that domain include all the resources. So similarly, from the same installation, you can create another domain as well. Okay, maybe for your in your development environment, or maybe in your non-production environment, you need one domain for your quality checks, and one you need for the development, and one may you need for the testing environment. So to save the cost, you can have these kind of capabilities where you can do a single installation, and then from your you can create multiple domains, like one domain for quality, one domain for testing, one domain for development. Okay, but however, in production, it is not recommended. In production, you will always have a single domain from a single installation of WebLogic server. So WebLogic domain is a fundamental administrative unit for WebLogic server. It comprises one or more WebLogic server instances with their resources, which are collectively managed and configured using a single administration server. Okay, so that means WebLogic domain is a fundamental administrative unit of WebLogic server. So as I said, the WebLogic domain is the initial unit or the initial basic entity which you have to configure after installation, and which will include all of your resources. And it include your different WebLogic server instances and the related resources. For example, you have a multiple managed servers, you have a multiple data sources, you have a cluster, then you have deployed multiple applications. So all will be inside your single domain. Okay. And which are collectively managed and configured using a single administration server. Okay, that means each domain will have only one single admin server. We'll see in next slide more on that. So what is an admin server? So domain include a special Oracle WebLogic server instance that is called admin server, which is the central point from which you configure and manage all resources in that domain. So as I said in my previous slide, okay, once you've done the installation of WebLogic, after that you have to create a domain, okay, and for each and every domain you will have a single admin server. Okay, so that means admin server is a singleton services. So each domain, so even you have a multiple domains, then each domain will have a single admin server. Okay, so that is which is a central point from which you can configure and manage all resources in that domain. Okay, so you may know that when you install a WebLogic server, you create a domain, and when you start your WebLogic server, and then you get a graphical interface, right? So that graphical interface is an interface for your admin server. From there, you configured all the resources, whatever you can able to do. Okay, there are command line utilities also there to configure the resources for the automation kind of stuff. But yes, most of the time we do all the configurations from the admin server console. So each domain will have a single admin server, and that will be used for the centralized management of your complete domain and for all the configurations of domain resources. So a domain always include only one instance of WebLogic server called the admin server. So a domain will have only one admin server. You can't have multiple admin servers, and this admin server is used for the centralized management and configurations of your complete domain. So one instance of WebLogic server in each domain act as admin server. So only one instance will act as an admin server. And the admin server provides a central point for managing a WebLogic server domain. So that means admin server is used for the complete end-to-end management, monitoring, and configurations of a particular domain. So we can deploy our application on admin server, but it is recommended to create managed servers and deploy your application in managed servers and leave admin domain for configuration and maintenance. So what does it mean? You all know that what we do with the application server, we deploy our applications on some servers, like application servers. So, but when we say about that a domain and which include only one admin server, and for managed servers, we'll see what exactly is managed server in the next slide. But when we say about we are deploying the application in our application server, so we do not deploy any application on the admin server, but the best practice is to deploy your application on the managed servers, because admin server is specifically designed for the centralized management of the complete domain and for the configurations. So we can let it as it is for the complete management of your centralized domain. Okay, however, there is no restrictions, because in sometimes in a non-production environment, maybe when you have some issues with the your hardware configurations is less, and you don't want to create many servers. Okay, because because it is a WebLogic server, it is a Java based application server, and each server run on the Java virtual machine JVMs, right, which take the memory and consume the resources. So if you have a limitation of hardware resources, then for testing purpose you can deploy your applications on only admin server, and then you can test the applications. Okay, but the best practice is do not deploy any application on admin server. Okay, so admin server is a singleton services. That means each domain will have only one admin server. So now let's talk about managed servers. Okay, so usually you configure a domain to include additional Oracle WebLogic server instances called managed servers. So each domain will have only one admin server, which will act as a centralized point for the complete monitoring and configurations of domain. But inside that one, you can have n number of WebLogic server instances. That means inside that you can create multiple servers that we called as a managed servers, and we deploy our all applications on managed servers. So you deploy your web applications, EJBs, web services, and other resources onto the managed servers and use the admin server for configuration and management purpose only. So managed server is an instance of your WebLogic server that is running on JVM and has its own configuration. So what does it mean? That every managed server run on a separate Java virtual machine, JVM, okay, which consume own memory and own hardware resources, and it has its own configuration. That means each managed server will have their own configurations. If we have two managed servers, then both will have their own configurations, configuration files, startup files. And similarly, if you have 4 or 5 managed servers, then all the managed servers will have their own configuration files. Okay, and in a managed server, we will deploy the Java components, web application, EJB applications, JMS applications, and web services. This is covered in our second point above. Okay, so we deploy all the Java-based web applications, okay, or Java-based applications on our managed servers. So there will be a 0 to n managed servers per domain. That means you can have a domain with 0 number of managed servers, or can have n number of managed servers. There is no limitation as far as your hardware is sufficient to cater the demand of thousands of managed servers, or 500 or 200 or 100 of managed servers. You can have n number of managed servers. 0 means when you have a domain, it doesn't mean that you have to create a managed server mandatory, because as I said, maybe you have a hardware resources and you have installed WebLogic for some kind of a testing. Then in that case, you can have only one admin server, and you can deploy your applications on admin server for testing purpose. So managed server is independent of other servers unless they are in cluster. So managed servers, if you have, suppose we have 2, 4, 5, 6, or n number of managed servers, they all are independent of each other, right? And but unless they are in the cluster. So cluster we'll see in the next slide. So what is a cluster? So cluster is a group of WebLogic server instances that work together to provide scalability and high availability for applications. So two important words here, scalability and high availability. Okay, so what does it mean, scalability? That today, suppose that you have an organization, and then where you have a consumer or end user base of 1,000, right? Maybe tomorrow your business is getting increased, your business is growing, and then maybe you have a user base of 2,000, and your internal employees is also growing from 200 to 400 or 500. That means the application that you have designed and built 2 years back, that need to be scaled to cater the extra demand, right, of the users or the load on your applications. So that means if 2 years back you had only 2 managed servers, then today you could need 4 managed servers or maybe 6 managed servers. So you have to make sure that your architecture is scalable, right, with respect to the growth of your business and the user base. And high availability in the sense, you have to make sure that your applications are available all the time. If you have only one managed servers and all applications are deployed on a single managed server, and that application get crashed, that managed server get crashed, that your application will bring down, completely bring down, right? Will bring down to all applications. So that means you have to make sure your application is highly available. That means you need at least more than one managed server, maybe 2 managed servers. So in case one managed server get crashed, the second will be available to serve the applications. That is a basic concept of high availability. Okay, so cluster is a group of WebLogic server instances that work together to provide scalability and high availability for applications. That means if we have more than one managed servers, for example, 2 managed servers, 4 or 6 managed servers, so we can define them in a single cluster. So for that, you have to create a cluster from the admin console, and then you have to assign all the managed server to the clusters. Okay, and your all applications, whatever running on your cluster, that will be same across all the managed servers. Okay, suppose you have a shopping cart application, and that is you deployed on 4 managed servers. So it is the same application which will serve for the end users. So you can deploy shopping cart application on 4 managed servers. Okay, and then you can define all 4 managed servers in a cluster for scalability and high availability. That means tomorrow, if your user base or load is getting increased, then in the same cluster, you can spin out a few more managed servers, and the same application will be deployed on the all managed servers, right? And if you have a 4 managed servers or maybe more than that one, so that means if in case of 1 is getting crashed, 2 is getting crashed, 3 is getting crashed, right? That means you have an option for high availability that your request will be served by the other managed servers. The cluster appears to client to be a single WebLogic server instance. So that means when the client access an application, okay, so client doesn't bother about in the backend how many managed servers are there, where my applications are running. So if you have a cluster with 4 or 5, 20 or 1,000 of managed servers, okay, where your same applications are running, a client, so it appears to client as a single instance, right? Because they access the application from the front end. So really they don't bother about from which managed server the requests are getting processed. And the server instances that constitute a cluster can run on the same machine or could be located on different machines. That means when I'm saying that a cluster is a group of managed servers, then you have the capability that you can you can have your managed servers scattered across the different machines or different servers. Okay, that is again a concept of high availability. For example, if I'm saying that I have a good configuration, a server with a good configurations, and I have configured my 10 managed server in that machine. Okay, so if suppose that that machine get crashed, right? So you have a 10 managed server, but all the servers are running on same server. That means all managed servers, all application servers, all application managed servers are running on single physical server. If that server get crashed, doesn't mean what kind of a configurations you had in your that physical server, but if that machine is get crashed, your all applications will be down, right? So in that case, to extend the term high availability, in WebLogic server, you have an option. You can span your cluster, okay, across multiple physical servers. For example, if I say I have 4 managed servers in a domain and in a cluster, so you can define an architecture where you can have a 2 managed server on machine 1 and 2 managed server on machine 2, and all 4 will be part of a single cluster. So what will happen in that case? If you have, if your machine 1 is getting crashed, then your machine 2 is up and running, where you have a 2 managed servers, right? Those can serve the request of the end clients. Okay, so you can increase a cluster's capacity by adding additional server instances to a cluster on an existing machine. So that means if you have a cluster where you are running certain managed servers, tomorrow you need some more managed servers to cater the demand of your business, then you can easily add few more managed servers to your cluster, right? And then what is our data source? The last time is about data source. Okay, we also say it as an connection pool, right? So a data source is an object that enables a Java database connectivity. Okay, Java database connectivity client to obtain a database connection. So in a simple term, every application as of today in enterprise world need a database, right? To store data, maybe whether it's a metadata of the application server or whether it is a custom data of the customers. Okay, but data is stored in database and your application need to be connected with the database, right? To get the data. So for that, in application server, you have a term called that is called a data source. Also, you can say it as a connection pool. Okay, so it's an object that enable a Java database connectivity client to obtain a database connection. So that means when your application server, where you have deployed certain applications, need a connection uh, to connect with the database, then it data source enable application server to connect with the database. So when we talk about Java database connectivity, which is called a JDBC, it is an application programming interface for the programming language Java, which define how a client may access a database. So JDBC is again a small code, okay, which is specifically designed for an Java-based applications to connect with the database. So when you install an application server, then it comes with some JDBC files, okay, APIs or JDBC files in a jar format, okay, and that jar file or JDBC file is used by the application server to connect with the database. So you configure database connectivity by adding data sources to your WebLogic domain. That means if you have a domain, and in a domain you are configuring multiple resources, you are deploying applications, and if your application need a connection from the database, that means you have to define a data source to connect with the data source for to database. And WebLogic JDBC data sources provide a database access and database connection management. Okay, so we'll talk about database connection management in next video in detail. So each data source contain a pool of database connections that are created when the data source is created at the server startup. So that means when we create a data source, so for that we define certain kind of a connection limits. Okay, the number of connections it create during from the database. Okay, so now for example, you have a certain parameters in database as well, like you have a certain session parameters that you where you allow the number of users to connect with your database. Okay, and then when we define a data source, there you have to define a certain minimum and maximum number of connections which can be created from the database. So when you define a data source, you can define a maximum and minimum limit of connections. So when you will start your uh, application server, or you can say when you will start your managed server, okay, then your data source will create that number of connections at the startup time. Okay, that increase the performance of your application, because when your application need a connections from the data source, it will include the ready to use connections. That means the connections that is already established with the database. So your application will take that connection from the data source connection pool, and then it will do transactions, and they will return back the connection again to the data source when it is not in use. Now, if we conclude the discussion that after the installation of a WebLogic server, we have a domain, suppose domain A, and the domain will have only one admin server. And suppose that we have 3 managed servers created in the domain, managed server 1, 2, and 3. And we have a same application, shopping cart, we have deployed on all the 3 managed servers. And now this is the same application that we have deployed in the managed servers. That means that is all 3 managed servers in the cluster, that cluster X. And then here, this application need a connection from the database, right? And to connect with the database, you need an entity or a resources in the domain, which is called a data source. And that data source is need to target to your cluster or to your all the managed servers so that they can take the connection from the database, right? So thank you for watching this video, and don't forget to subscribe my channel, okay? And stay tuned for the next video. Thank you very much.